Welcome to everyone. I don't say any good morning or good evening because we don't know exactly the time is, but it's a little bit strange but nice to have this alignment of timing. We have today our session is on, as you can see by the title, this application of baseline development. So, as typically in the GTAP conference, we have several sessions on technicalities on modeling, or how can we improve our capability in modeling, in quantitative tools, and so this is exactly the session of today. We have 4 presenters, and I'm quite happy because the heterogeneity of the topic that we are going to touch. Because we have the first one by Nong, which is currently researcher at the Commonwealth Scientific Industrial and Research Organization, and then he's presenting us the GTAP food, which and then is a baseline calibration with a focus on food. But then again, that is quite we are quite happy that is a baseline calibration, so we are waiting to see what Nong is telling us. And then we have our friend Paul Gretton from the Australian National University, and he's also visiting fellow at the Crawford School, but probably you know Paul, so there is not much to say. And again, is an historical validation of saving and trade intensity using the GDIN-FS model and an historically informed baseline projection. So our first 2 papers are focusing on the baseline calibration and projection, and then the other 2 is by the third one is by Kalindeb, which is working at Economic Research Institute. He has been also associate professor at the Queen's University, an assistant professor at the Essex University. And in this case, we move a little bit more on the monetary policy in CG model, which is clearly quite important issue to cover when we use models. And finally, we have Turakulov, I hope I pronounce correctly, which is a graduate school of University. And then in this case, we are the title is How Central Asia to Escape from Trade Isolation, and this is more a policy targeted scenario by CG modeling. So our 4th paper is more on the policy side, while baseline. So I guess that we can start with our first presenter, and I ask to people which are not presenting and not speaking to mute the microphone and to turn off or to stop the video, so the quality of the connection could be better. And then yes, 20 minutes for presenting, 10 minutes for discussion, and so I leave the floor to Nong.
So can everyone see the slide of this? Yeah?
Yes, we can see.
Yeah, hello everyone. My name is Rino, and today I would like to talk about our new model GTAP, and we are in the process to check the result from the baseline. So today we would like to talk about the result with a focus on food, and we developed this model with I developed this model with our colleagues at CSIRO in Australia. And there are 5 sections today. And first of all, I talk about the research background and also the development of the GTAP model. And after that, I will talk about the baseline assumption and the result. And finally, I will highlight some future development and application. And as we know, that the future technology development, environmental and social economic trends like the GDP growth or population growth may have the complex impact on the agricultural and food system. So we are really in need of the comprehensive foresight modeling to provide the detailed analysis. So at CSIO, we have the collaboration project with the Australian government department ABS to develop an integrated modeling approach, and we based on our core model, the GTAP food model, to link with other partial equivalent model or like TIMIS or some other model. And the purpose is to facilitate detailed and insightful analysis of global and regional agricultural and food system. So we have some three sub targets in the project. First of all, we try to update the to the new database in 2014 from the database in 2007. And the second target is we try to have more detail and key animal source and seafood sector. So that's if we want to have more live animal meat and fishery sector. So with the new database, we also expect to uh, have the new production and consumption structure in the model. And we also try to reorganize the sectoral and regional aggregation level compared to the previous version because of the new demand from our customer. And so when for the database development, when we look at the GTAP database and we think about some key sector or the key commodities that we want to integrate into the sub commodities, and we look at the key commodities related to food, and here the five commodities that we will expect to integrate into more detailed commodities. And for the three targets in the model, the first target is we try to have to update the new database in 2014. And lastly, the target number one. For the target number two is to have the more detailed animal and seafood sector in the database. So lastly, we want to get the production share of and consumption share and trade share. And in this case, we look at there are two methods. One need to collect the share from the website of the government or indication. However, in this way, it's quite time consuming. And that's why we select the second method. That's based on the existing input output table. And when we search on the literature, there are three types of the input output table available. That's the first one is EORA, but we not utilize this input output table. And I will explain a little bit later. And for the FarmBio and impact fees, we use this database and to aggregate and to get the production share and consumption share to aggregate the main commodity in the database. And for example, for the FarmBio data, we also check with the meat production in the FAO and FarmBio data. For example, to ensure that the live animal measured in tons is greater than the meat production measured in tons. So in this case, when we obtain the production share and consumption share, we can split into the more detailed animal food sector. So when we look at the ERA IO table, we identify the pros and cons of the database, and we compare the difficulties and also the advantages of the database. And when we look at the disadvantages of the database, is the sector names are not identical across region, and also the number of sectors are not the same across region. So when we combine the advantages and disadvantages, we come up to a conclusion that we not use this IO table. And for bio data, we also do the same thing, and we compare the advantages and disadvantages, and we check with the data aggregation requirement, like we should have the subsector name are identical across regions and the share of the subsector in the name monetary value. So when we do that and uh, we we compare the difficulties and also the advantages of the database, we come up to the conclusion that we want to use this one for the lead aggregation. And here you can see that in the first panel is the Fabio sector. That's the And on the left hand side, you can see that's the GTAP main sector. Here we match with the Fabio sector, and after that we come up to the on the right hand side. You can see that we have the more detailed food sector for the GTAP food model. And in this case, we did again GTAP four main sector commodity into 8 commodities. And for the impact, because FarBio not have the detail of the fishery sector, that's why we use the impact this database. It has the 16 fisheries species for both wild capture and aquaculture. So we also do the same similar approaches to compare between advantages and disadvantages, and we come up to a conclusion that we will use this database to disaggregate this into aquaculture and bioculture data for our GTAP model. And when we have the new database, we also try to modify the production and consumption structure in the model to fit with the new database. And currently in the model, it had the technology bundle industry. That's the one output, but we have the multiple technology or processing input. So currently in the previous version, it had 3 technology bundle industry. That's the elliptic speed variation, iron and steel manufacturing, and land transportation sector. And we add to the model of the GTAP food model to process new processing bundle industry. That is the meat processing industry that's used to commodities beef and lamb, but there is only one output, that is the meat, and it's similar to the fish, and with to processing aquaculture and wild capture fishery. For the production structure of the non-food industrial sector, here we divide the energy into the 4 kinds of commodities and allow the substitution and also the endowment factor. It looks quite similar to the GTAP model structure, but here for the energy it has less detail than the GTAP model. And for the production structure of the processing bundle ruminant meat processing sector, as you can see that we divide the processing into process 1 and process 2, that is cow related and sheep related, and we allow the substitution between the 2 processes. However, the specific input for each process is not substitutable. So for each process, it has the, for example, for lamb, sheep, it has the lamb processing meat, and also live sheep, animal, and other inputs here, and as well as for other process, the same. And also because the new database, we also develop the new consumption structure for the GTAP food. That's we divide food demand for along with the different categories. That is the animal source foods and staple other crops and processed foods, as you can see in the figure here. So about the baseline, first of all, we follow the NSP2 projection. That is based on the GDP and population projection. However, we also have some sector projection based on, for example, for the crop sector, we have the productivity shock assumption in this case, and also for livestock sector, we also have the percentage change of the output sector or the output efficiency. And for forestry, fishery, and food processing sector, we also have the output efficiency assumption in our scenario. And the database, the projection, we based on the projection from the impact model. Lastly, for the agriculture sector, and we also have the fuel efficiency, input efficiency applied to many other sectors like in the transport sector, electricity generation sector, energy intensive, and other sector, for example, like the fuel efficiency for fire demand. And we also have the electricity output projection for 15 electricity generation technology following the database provided by our own energy unit. And here I would like to show you some of our results, and we are still in the process to check the result, and we hope that we can have some comment or some opinion from the audience here. And when we look at the result, for example, here is so in table 1 is so the world output level measured in 2014 dollars value, and when we look at the result, and we think that is look quite reasonable for us right now. And for example, when we look at the coal output of coal, it decreased over time because we put, and the natural gas also decreased over time. It's because we project renewable and renewable power will grow at high rate to substitute for the fossil-based electricity. That's why the coal output have to decrease. However, it had the result in the initial level that later on I will show you. And for example, for the output of wheat in major producing country, and when we look at the result, for example, in Australia, measured in 2014 and dollars measured in 2014 dollars, and it's increased by the, for example, the compound annual growth rate in 2020 to is about 1.2%. It's from 7.7 billion to 12.3 billion dollars in this case. But for China, we we are not very sure that's why China in this case it decreased the wheat output, and also for Russia also slightly decreased over time. And here I would like to show you the output of live cow and meat, the beef, and in the unit is measured in thousand of head, no thousand of ton in this case, a million of ton in this case. Sorry for mistake. And when we see that this one, for example, it one the the units the values of the live cow always greater than the value of meat in this case. And when we look at the world value, it's about 175 million tons of the live cow, live animal, but also for the meat only produce only 70 million tons in this case. So for the result, we think that it look quite reasonable in this case for up to from 2020 to 2060 for cow and beef meat in this instance. And also for sheep, animal, and lamb as well, we do the same methods. So we look at the result, for example, the values of the animal have to greater than the values of the unit. That's measured in the million tons in this case. So, for example, in 2040, it's about 30% or 26% of the value of meat compared with the values of the live sheep, and the compound annual growth rate for sheep is about 1.2%. And also we look at the output of the aquaculture and wild capture fishery, the values is measured in the billion tons in this instance, and we see that many countries increase the output of both aquaculture and wild capture fishery. Only the wild capture fishery slightly decreased in Japan, as you can see in this case, and we think that it might be because of the climate change impact that affect the harvest in Japan during the period. But maybe in the future we need to look at the literature to see whether it makes sense or not. But on the overall on the global scale. And when we look at the result on the global scale, the world level, I think the compound annual growth rate about 0.5%, that is quite percent. And we also look at some result in Australia, and we see that, for example, only thing is we think about the where result is about the total emission in this case. So in Australia, the emission level when we have the baseline result is the emission level decrease over time from 2030 to 2060. So that's maybe not a good result in our instance. But when we look at other results, for example, agricultural emission from agricultural sector is also increased slightly over time. And also the share of the agricultural emission of the total emission also increased from 0.2% to 0.3% in no 0.2 to 0.3 from 2030 to 2060. And
I know
also
it's 2 minutes.
yeah. And also when we look at the global emission level, the cumulative percentage change compared to 14 we can see that the emission level decreased over time, and we should see this result related to emission level recently. So at this time we haven't got time to fit it yet, but I think this one will not look quite reasonable because we believe that the emission level will be increased, for example, from 2020 to 2060. But in our baseline scenario, it shows the decrease in the emission level, maybe because we allow the renewable power to increase to substitute for fossil-based electricity. That's why the coal output and also demand for coal decrease. It leads to reduction in the emission level, and maybe we need to revise the projection related to the power sector. And for the future development and application, for future model development, we will try to improve the climate damage function, and we also try to incorporate the material demand, and also try to incorporate the water and land resources following the GTAP-W and GTAP-AES model. And for the potential application, we think about the application to study the carbon tax, carbon border adjustment, or the negative emission technology, climate change impacts, or also something related to like African swine fever. Yeah. So that's all my presentation today.
Okay, thanks a lot. No, so the floor is open for question, as already Angel wrote in the chat. If you have any question, you can just write down in the chat, and I will collect. And in the while we are waiting for questions from participants, I have one question and one clarification for Nong.
Yes.
So my question is, my comment is that you split very well the livestock sector and then the fishery between wild capture and aquaculture. But then I wonder that an issue, or at least an improvement, could be to split also the OFD sector in GTAP, which is the other food, because in the other food we have the processed fish, and for trade perspective, it's quite relevant. So even if you are very detailed in the fisheries, then clearly for trade perspective you need to work a little bit. And then my other comment or request for clarification is about what have you done in this calibration of the baseline on climate policies? Because I don't know if you plug into the calibration of the model any Paris Agreement or any climate policy within countries that as could be for the EU 2030 or whatever. Because I've seen that in Australia the emission in the agricultural sector were rising. And then I have a question from the participants, so you can reply to all of these. Okay, just one, because now there are more than there are two. Oh, so the first one is from Paul. Has consideration being given to relaxing the Leontief assumption in the intermediate bundle? So the question is, if you are taking into account in the future, if you want to relax the Leontief assumption in the intermediate bundle. And then we have a question straight from Angel. Okay, the very research shocks. So Angel is asking, the GDP targets are also considered. So if in these shocks you plug in the model, if GDP targets are considered or not, and if are considered, which variable catch it? If not, how does the implied GDP growth relate to other projection of GDP? Say the social pathway number 2, let's say, could be an example. So mainly the point is, which assumption are you making in this baseline calibration according to the different social pathways? Okay.
Yes, for our baseline, we use we following the GDP and population projection from we use from the OECD model, the ASP2. So we shop the GDP following their projection. That's right. And we swap the variable, the GDP with the real GDP with the output augmenting technology efficiency variable.
Okay. And about the Leontief at the intermediate level, the question from Paul.
For the Leontief, in this case, for example, for the processing need here, because we assume that because we divide the input into particular process, that is count related and SIP related. So when we have the specific input for each process, it means that it indicates that we not allow the substitution between these commodities. Otherwise, it will become the normal sector or the commodities in GTAP model, for example. So in this case, when we talk about the processing or the technology bundle industry, this means that we only have, in this case, we only have the one meat commodity, but we have two inputs that we SIP related and cow related commodities. The inputs, but the outputs only we produce on only one commodity. That's why we apply the Leontief function in this instance.
Okay, thanks, Nong. I guess that we don't have any other questions. So thanks again for your presentation. Thanks for sharing with us your interesting work. And so now I guess that we can move to our second presenter, which I can see that Paul is already ready with the camera. So we already did the presentation of the authors. So I just leave the floor to Paul. And again, I ask to all the other people to mute and stop the video to maintain the quality of the connection at good level. And if you have any question, you can put in the chat and I will collect at the end of the presentation. So the floor is yours, Paul.
Oh, thank you. Can you see my? I can't see my. You can see my PowerPoint.
Yes, even if they are. Yeah, now we can see. Yes.
Good. Good. I'll move away. I'll just go to the title. So in the title, I'm going to look at historical validation from the point of view of saving and trader intensities. And I'm using the GDINE FS model, which some of you may be familiar with, but I'll describe a little bit as I go. And then I'm looking at the historical validation going from 2011 to 2019, and then historically informed baseline projections of those items, those trade and savings items, forward to 2100, but I'll only be reporting 2050. Now, the structure of my presentation will be, I'll just give you a little bit of background first to the focus of the exercise. Then I'll talk a little bit about how I target the savings rate and trade shares by region, and then looking at the exercise from the historical validation path, moving from there to the forward projection path, which the switchover period in this exercise is 2019-2020. And then I'm going to introduce some trade intensity indexes by region, but I don't think I'll have time to go into that in detail in the presentation, but we could come to that in questions. And then a conclusion and some policy implications of the projections. So there will be a methodological part to the presentation as well as a policy element. Now, the first thing that we can observe, and it's very common in the literature, is that the future is uncertain. So and in the trade area and in the savings area. For example, when we look at global exports as a measure of globalization, we see that the current exports to global product is flat after a period of extensive growth. So there's a question: is what will be the future, and how might that affect the trading relationships between countries? The second point that is quite prominent is that China, that's the red line on the right-hand chart, has got a very high gross savings to GDP ratio, high by its own standards, but very high by global standards. So the question is, what possible path might that savings rate take into the future? And parallel, what possible paths might there be for other countries? And you can see from the historical data that the year-to-year numbers jump around quite a lot. So just talking about the GDINE FS model, the origins of it is the GDINE model, which is published in 2012 in the book form. But since I've been looking at it, I've made a number of quite important extensions. So my version is the GDINE FS model, and FS stands for finance and savings. Now, what I've done is I've extended the partial adjustment rules for capital accumulation to provide for long-run model stability, which is absolutely crucial. So this model that I'm looking at will basically simulate to infinity without crashing. And there's a particular reason for that, which I'll mention in a moment. And then I've allow in the exercise for regional differences in institutions and risk, a fairly simple treatment. Now, to get the model to be stable, I've introduced an elemental treatment of adjustment costs. And that is simply because the standard database doesn't include a reconciliation between factor shares and savings. And the theory of adjustment costs is dependent on the relationship between those two things. So I've got an elementary treatment of adjustment costs to accommodate the difference between to reconcile those two sides. If you do not reconcile those two sides of the model will eventually fail, and it wouldn't really matter which model. I've added a CET-CES theory for modeling mobility of capital between regions. So I've got capital inflows and capital outflows of the original model, but with a CET-CES function. I've introduced CES theory for modeling regional household consumption and savings choices. And you'll see that'll become quite important shortly through the use of twist variables for modeling changes in behavior and short-run adjustment. So the extended capabilities achieve model stability and greater flexibility. And that's covered in my previous papers. So what have I done in this paper? I've got some new enhancements to focus on the evolving savings and trade intensities. Now, contrary to the previous paper, which took a very bottoms-up approach, this takes a top-down approach. So I'm looking at savings for a region, for each region, and trade intensities for each region. Firstly, over the historical period, 2012 to 2019. So I'm starting with a 2011 database. And then I go from 2020 to, well, 2100, but I'll be reporting to 2050, which is a forward-looking baseline. The other thing that I've done is in the GTAP model, the savings is not on a system of national accounts basis. I've adjusted savings to a systems of national accounts basis, so it's compatible with World Bank data on gross savings. To help with analysis of trade projections, I've introduced a Brown, Kojima, and Drysdale Trade Intensity Index, which I'll hope to get to at the end of my presentation, but we may not get into details. So the supporting data I've used is the historical data from the World Development Indicators, ILO labour market data, and forward data from the IMF economic outlook, ILO projections, and the shared socio-economic pathways in the medium growth scenario, SSP2. Now, my database, this work is in summary form, but it's quite meaningful. I have a small open economy, Australia. I have China, Japan, United States as being dominant commodity economies in the global trade setting. I've got, it's the Europe 28. It's not the Union anymore, but and the rest of the world. And then I've had 13 industrial sectors and 5 primary factors, inputs. And that granularity enables quite a number of important points to be brought out in the projections. So what I've done in taking this top-downs approach to taking the forward baseline with the trade and savings emphasis, I'm looking at growth savings, exports, imports, and the balance of trade as shares of GDP. And so they fit in to the system of national accounts. GDP is equal to consumption plus investment, X minus M. So I'm targeting the X and the M. I'm targeting, that's in equation 1, I'm targeting gross savings in equation 2, but as a share of GDP. But in the GDINE FS model, savings is measured on a net basis. So as we progress, we see we need to actually implement the targets through net savings. We don't implement them directly through gross savings because the savings behavior is defined in net terms. And then the balance of trade being exports minus imports, but also net lending minus transfers. And that will become important later. Now, what are some of the issues that you encounter in this? Well, the first issue that I've mentioned to you is that savings to GDP ratio has to be targeted indirectly via equation 3. We have a negative value problem. Both savings and the balance of trade can be negative. So to get around that problem, I've indexed the shares to 1. So instead of being indexed naturally to 0 as in the data, all my shares are indexed to 1 so that I don't get negatives. The savings definition problem, which I've mentioned, I've converted GTAP data on savings to a GDINE to an SNA basis. Now, then the next part of the next tricks, I suppose, which I'll go into, is the selection of, if I'm targeting exports, imports, and savings, and the balance of trade, what are the endogenous variables or the slack variables? And when we target that, we'll see that you can have a known target or an interaction target where you actually can't target an item precisely. It's a one-sided target. And I'll illustrate that shortly. Now, how do I do this? So I'm targeting these macro variables in the tops-down approach. I'm using a partial adjustment process, which is familiar in the GTAP framework and in other fields. So where I argue, and I've implemented it in a flexible way. So the first flexible way is I define a required growth in the actual rate of my target variable to align the actual and target values. And the target values will be taken by the data, which I'll describe. So on one hand, I allow the gap to be closed gradually using the partial adjustment process by parameter lambda. And that process, that's relevant to the forward-looking baseline where we're going to a long-run target. But when we're doing an historical validation, what we'd like to do is target the values that we wish year by year. So from 2011 to 2012, we're going to hit the 2012 value, and from 2012 to 2013, the 2013 value, and so on. And we also might wish to introduce endogenous theory on the target. So to enable that, I have a second element where we close the gap in a single year. So one is the right-hand one is the historical validation. The left-hand is the progressive adjustments to the long run. And you can see the partial adjustment factor is between 0 and 1. And for the right-hand case, implicitly the partial adjustment factor is 1. And here we have the base year data is determined from, or base year is determined by the data and added to a database, the base year database, and updated each year to 2019 using historical data. And then after that, we use the post 2019 long run projections. And so we have the actual shares, and the actual shares, that's the target shares. And then we have actual shares which are given in the database. Okay. Now, closing the model. Now, this is where it becomes this is the really important part in some ways in the theory. We need to have a closing. So let's look at just savings. The savings behavior. We want to target a level of savings either in the partial adjustment method or direct total adjustment method. So we want to change the savings to GDP share. The natural variable, if we're talking about savings behavior, the natural variable is the consumption savings choice of a country, in a country. And in the new theory that I've introduced, I've got a twist variable, a price neutral twist variable, which enables that choice to be varied. Then we're talking about import tolerance. Now what can bring about a change in the import tolerance? Well, we have a required change in imports to GDP is determined by our target measure. The slack variable I have is imported augmenting technical change. In other words, what's not specifically allowed for in the model is allowed for through this shadow technology term. Now, this is a tops-down method. So basically, this term is mopping up everything that's not captured in any other element of the baseline. So that's the savings behavior and import tolerance side of things. But in the other side, I've got export intensity and trade balance. And I adopt different approaches here between the historical simulation and the forward simulation. In historical data, I target the export intensity. We know what they are from the World Bank data. So, and but in the forward projections, it'll be slack, and I'll mention that in a moment. So the slack variable I've got is regional household foreign domestic financial holdings. And that's the proxy for net lending. So if I run an export surplus, I'll build up foreign balances of my domestic households. If the reverse is the case, my balances will be run down. Now, in the long run, seeing I'm targeting imports in every year, in the long run, my natural target variable is the balance of trade. In other words, the permitted trade balance. So in the historical period, the balance of trade is endogenous, and in the long run, it's exogenous, and the export intensity varies. But you can see it all balances out. So, but I think logically, the sensible thing is to target the balance of trade in the long run. Okay, now the other part is the adjustment parameter, which I'll mention briefly. The adjustment parameter adopted is 0.75. So that closes half the gap in 7 years. So some convergence literature in, say, Barrow, Sally and Martin put the convergence factor at 0.05, which is in 11 years to close half the gap. And some GDINE rate of return work takes 0.2, which is 2 years. Looking at the historical data, 7 years seems to be a reasonable compromise, but the other variables would also be an option. So now I'll move from that to look at the baseline.
Hey, Paul, you have 5 minutes, huh?
5 minutes, I better move quickly. So I'll just say that if you look at the baseline in GDP, population and skilled labour, historical data is very messy, but the SSP2 projections are quite smooth and going down, but with China and the rest of the world having higher growth rates. But let's look at the gross savings rate, what I've done in China, particularly. So in the projections, you can see my simulations drive the China savings rate into the neighborhood of other countries. It doesn't quite get there, but it goes to the neighborhood. So you'll see that dotted line. The other countries, after a bit of research, I've basically taken them as a business as usual, which you can see there. But in the trade scenario, I've taken a different, more elaborate approach. I've got medium, increased, lower potential and high potential, which I won't go into the details here so I can get on to so quickly present some of the results. But you'll see from here the medium and high. So the top dotted line is the high growth scenario, which gives a trade elasticity of about 1.29, and it just happens that Beckers et al. In 2020 came up with, over a slightly different period, with a similar elasticity. But that could be at the higher end of things. A business as usual, which is my low, produces an elasticity of about 1, and my medium case, which I'll focus on, produces the other case. So this system, this method I'm looking at, gives the option of looking at different trade scenarios. So an export growth, I'll just mention this and I'll skip over the next two, is you'll see that the EU, which is the green line at the top, it flattens out as it reaches its target value of about 50% of GDP. But I've got the rest of the world, which is the grey line underneath, converging towards the EU. So I've got a large number of countries trading with each other, and my medium run scenario and the high growth scenario assume that it converges towards the EU type or the European case, because we've got large number of countries trading with each other. The other countries, as you'll see, are fairly flat, except for China, which is declining. And the reason it's declining is that it's moving from a substantial trade surplus to much closer to balance. And in that case, its trade with the rest of the world as a proportion of GDP declines, which I'm capturing in this graph. I won't talk about the other two. You'll see that the balance of trade converges to country-specific values, and China remains a net lender and US remains a net borrower. We could talk about, but we'll just talk about quickly the share of what this gives in the regional share of global imports. You see the rest of the world, which is a high growth region, is becoming much more important in global trade relative to other parts, other regions, and the EU will become less important according to these projections. And you'll see that at the beginning there's a slight overlap with actual data, and my projections don't do too badly. Okay, I won't talk about these indexes, but they are in the slides. So let me move.
Paul, please, if you can go straight to conclusion, otherwise we don't have time to discussion. Yeah. We already have one question.
Okay, so what I've got now is a stable model for longer run baselines and beyond. It's possible to track year-to-year trades in clear structural ratios and give forward projections, provides a basis for more nuanced macro projections, and there's a clear potential for economic gravity to shift with the rest of the world, which has substantial policy implications, particularly around preferential arrangements versus relative to multilateral arrangements. Okay, so there's a methodological element to this, but there's also at the end some strong policy element. Thank you very much, Alessandro. Will I stay with my slides, or will I come back and be a person?
Yeah, okay. Thanks a lot, Paul. This is a very nice presentation. It's quite crucial for the current modeling perspective because you see there are many sessions, climate change, for example, where the baseline projection and the policy scenario are really towards 2050, 2080, whatever. So, Paul, we have for now 2 questions. The first one by our first presenter. So, thank you, Paul. Can you explain more why saving in China gradually returns to the neighborhood levels, and what are the drivers? This is the first question. So, it's why China, as you show, the curve of China is going down. And then we have a question by Angel. It's very active today. Again, thanks, Paul. So GTAP treats savings as residual. GDP and balance trade are respected, leaving C, G, and I to adjust. So I hope that that is clear, but you can also find in the chart. With adjusted high, so investment, and balance trade, export and import, saving is calibrated. So saving is residual to the other 3 variables. How do you accomplish the redefinition of savings? Are you changing consumption, private and governments? So this is the question of Angel. If it's not clear, Angel can repeat vocally. Okay, thanks, Paul. So for now, we have these 2 questions. If you can reply, because are quite interesting questions. Thanks.
Yeah, no, excellent questions. Thank you very much, and it gives me opportunity of talking a little bit more about it. Look, firstly about China. China's a really difficult one, and I could see people having different views. So if you look at the old CP projections, they brought the China savings rate down to 35% of GDP. That was the ones that were released with the first GDINE, and that 35% is roughly the historical average. And they just sort of say, well, look, historical average is the best indicator of the future. If you take key parameters from the Chinese data and include it in the Ramsey model as outlined in Barrow, Sally and Martin, in I think it's chapter 3 or 4, and then derive a new savings rate, given their population growth, given their structural ratios, you come in with a projection of savings as a proportion of GDP between 20 and 30%, which is much closer to what you see for other economies. And if you use the same methodology for the other economies, you come in with something roughly around the historic average. Not exactly, So what I've done is I've said, well, look, it's likely to come down, which you can see that's in the data. Their savings rate is coming down as they move more towards, domestic consumption and less towards export-led growth. But we really don't know where it's going to end up. If you project it to 35%, you got the scope of having ever-expanding trade balances, positive trade balances. If you bring it down into the neighborhood of the 25%, which is roughly the other countries, it's much more natural to come somewhere close to a trade balance. So you could have a significant discussion on what the rate is, but the number, the 25, roughly the neighborhood of the other countries has the characteristic of being the neighborhood of other countries, a bit higher than Japan, as you saw, and certainly higher than the US and Europe. But it also has the advantage of being in the neighborhood of a value that would be suggested by this first approximation of the Ramsey model. In the paper, I actually give all the calculations. But I think where I've ended up is probably a fair, it's probably not unreasonable, but I could see that people would have differences of, there could be differences of opinion. So that's why the savings is coming down. The way I bring it down is that that method that I have a twist term. So I just switch between consumption and savings. So the representative household consumes more and saves less, and that's just feeds into the rest of the model. But Angwell, so I'll move on to Angwell's questions about the savings as a residual. Well, you can see savings in this model is partially a residual, simply because income is divided between consumption and savings. But the share of savings in income, as I've just described, is not a residual. So if you just simply shock the ratio of the savings share, you will actually affect the residual becomes the balance of trade. In other words, if you just shock the savings consumption share towards the representative household, the savings balance for China will move from being a large surplus more towards balance, which is I've got here. So savings is in one sense is a residual, but there is an element of savings behavior in this model, and it's quite deliberately introduced. Now, consumption, and then the next part of the question was the government consumption and private consumption choice. So what I've got the CES choice between consumption and savings combined with the twist theory. With consumption, government consumption, private consumption, I've actually retained the original Cobb-Douglasy assumption on the basis that I haven't really got grounds for changing it. So I'm using the relationship between private consumption and government consumption is Cobb-Douglas, and that's just given by it's just a result of the simulation. But it's very important to understand that in this model, savings is not a residual; it's part of the behaviour of the regional household. Has that answered the question?
I think so. I mean, I don't know if Angel want to add something. For me, it was quite clear, but yeah. Angel, if you want to reply. I guess, yes. Okay, so Angel just said that it's clear. And I guess that if we don't have any other questions, which mainly for me was only only one just comment on my side is that if you're taking into account, because you said that you were referring to the historical savings rate, I remember one slide, not to target the model. I wonder if you never think about that the composition of the population, so the aging of population can change. I mean, the aging of population will change, and then probably the saving behavior will change accordingly. So that could be an issue that when you are projecting 2050 or whatever, especially in some area like European Union or North America, you can have a completely different partner of savings which are not strictly linked to the when you pool the population, then you pool the savings, but this could be completely different if the age of population, the class of age of population changes. Actually,
that's a really interesting question, and I've thought about it. and I've deliberately haven't done anything about it. And I'll give you my reason. In my Ramsey model, my simplified Ramsey model, first approximation, I have population growth. So in the information I'm taking into account does include population growth. So low population growth tends to lower savings. Now, but why haven't I mean, you can only do so much, but what reservations have I got towards doing more than that? Well, if you've got a low population, what becomes a scarce factor? Low population growth. What becomes a scarce factor? The scarce factor becomes people, and that will raise the cost of labour relative to capital. And so the economies could well become more capital intensive and hence more savings intensive. When I've read that, when you read a lot of the comments on these things, they talk about, oh, as you get older, you know, you can spend your residual balances, so your propensity to consume will rise. But the other side of the coin is that the labour costs will rise, and the population as a whole will actually need to save more so it can invest more to maintain its population living standards. So that's a thought that I've had, and it's perhaps one of the thoughts that's behind the thinking, is to simply take a total savings rate as being not ridiculous. So what you see is Japan. I haven't driven the savings rate for Japan down, to historic, below its historical levels, and that's a case where the population is clearly declining relative to the historical population growth numbers. And the population growth numbers I used were the 2050 ones too, not the current ones. Just to add that point.
Yeah. Okay, thanks a lot, Paul. So thanks again. Now we can move to our next presentation, which is highly related with the Paul's one. So we have monetary policy in the CG model, and the presenter is Galindev. I hope I pronounced correctly. And then, as usually, you have 20 minutes. I will tell you when 5 minutes to the hand, and then we have 10 minutes for discussion, and you can put your question in the chat, and I will try to read for you, and then if needs any clarification, you can interact. So the floor is you, Galindev.
Okay, can you hear me now?
We can hear you. Okay.
Can you
and we can see
slides?
The presentation. Yeah, we can see your slide. We have only one gray box, at least in my screen. I don't know if there is a sort of a small gray box which that can make yeah, we have this. Yeah, exactly. Right. The one you attach. Yeah, exactly. Thanks. If you can take out or move more on the right side. Yeah.
Down. Okay.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks, Galina.
Okay. Okay. My name is Raksha. You can call me Raksha, and Galindev is my second surname. Okay. This work is done with Bernard de Galluve from Laval University. So. Okay, so all the valuation on new classical CG models have numeraire. So that is the price or price index to which all the remaining prices are relative to. So the numeraire cannot be determined endogenously because of the interrelationship of the equilibrium conditions of the model. But this satisfies the Walras law. So you know all about the Walras law. So numeraire is usually the consumption price index or nominal exchange rate in these real models. So in real GDP CG models, so that means there is no nominal rigidities. the choice of numeraire doesn't really matter. You just choose any price as the numeraire, and the shocks give exactly the same results without any nominal rigidities. So what about the implications of nominal rigidities in the short run? So we know about this in the short run. So some models have nominal rigidities already. So for example, these PEP standard CG models, partnership for economic policy, standard CG models, they have some nominal variables exogenous and fixed exogenously. So because of these nominal rigidities, the same shock could have different effects depending on the choice of the numeraire. So that's the argument we can find. So in that case, what's the numeraire in the short run? So in the short run, there are some variables are exogenous, nominal variables are exogenous, and then we just change in the numeraire, and then the results are different. So in this paper, we are trying to present that, argue that the numeraire is actually the target of monetary policy, monetary authority. So we know that the redundant equilibrium equation has a flip side, which is basically the nominal equilibrium condition. So the central bank adjusts its instrument to control the numeraire in the model. The different numeraire means the different targets for the central bank. So if the nominal exchange rate is the numeraire, the central bank controls its monetary policy instruments to achieve the same level of exchange rate. If the consumption price index is the numeraire, central bank is doing other things to achieve the consumption price at its target. So increase or decrease in numeraire can be understood as the central bank is actually adjusting their target. Okay? And we know that depending on the central bank's target, the same shock could have different effects, different real effects. But we know that in this model, money market operation is still very implicit in the real model with nominal rigidities. So we know that there is a body of literature that endogenizes numeraire by developing detailed financial markets within CG models. We know that from Prison and Yao and Robinson and so many other papers. You can see that. They're called financial CG models. And we know that the numeraire in those models are replaced by explicit financial market equilibrium conditions. As monetary policy actions are explicit, we know what the monetary policy is doing. But those models are actually quite data intensive. So that's the downside of this approach. Here, we are trying to propose a very simple approach to introduce an explicit monetary policy in CG models. So we have this Pep 1T model, which is a recursive dynamic CG model of the Kalu network. So this model is calibrated to Mongolian social accounting matrix. The numeraire in this model is now going to be replaced by Taylor type interest rate rule. So this is a very famous rule now used by kind of monetary policy rule used by central banks. Okay, the central bank in this Taylor rule says central bank controls the short-term interest rate to reduce the gap between desired and actual inflation rates, and also trying to reduce the output gap between actual and natural levels. Some weights are attached to the gaps, very important, and this Taylor rule are very famous because the modern DSG type of models are using these rules. So the state-of-the-art DSG is using this. So first, we are going to consider more general interest rate rule. So in addition to the inflation gap and output gap, we have the exchange rate gap between desired and actual actual depreciation of the exchange rate. So then we are going to show that the Pep Quantity Model is actually a special case of the current monetary model. And we know that nominal interest rate is now linked with the real interest rate through the Fisher equation and the expected inflation rate. And the real interest rate determines Tobin's Q and the user cost of capital. And given the expected inflation rate and change in the nominal interest rate can change the real interest rate, which affects Tobin's Q and hence real investment. And then it's going to have some real effects. So we're going to attach a sufficiently high weight is attached to the inflation gap. The current model is going to replicate the real CG model in which consumption price index is the numeraire. Or we can attach very high weight on the exchange rate depreciation gap. The model is going to be the real model in which the numeraire is the nominal exchange rate. Or we're going to assume that the central bank doesn't care about any gaps. The model is basically the standard model in which the real exchange rate is the numeraire. By the way, this Pep Quantity Model is very standard CG models, as all the things we know about the CG model. So now I'm going to introduce some equations, variables. So you can see here this one. So this one is the dynamic CG model, and we have to consider steady state equilibrium conditions or balanced growth path. So the first one is the steady state inflation rate. So you can see the D represents difference. P is the price, D is for the domestic price, S as steady state. And then we have this steady state price level, and we have this steady state foreign inflation rate, and then we steady state foreign price level. And then steady state, given these two exchange rates, we have this relative purchasing power parity condition, which determines the steady state exchange rate. And the steady state or balanced growth path, these are the nominal variables. They're going to grow, the population growth, population index, and the domestic price index, steady state. These are the real variable. And this one is the real variable. This is the population growth rate. And this one is the interest rate parity condition. So this is the domestic nominal interest rate. Sorry, this one is the real interest rate. This is the domestic nominal interest rate. This is the expected inflation rate. So this one is the real interest rate. So this is basically the Fisher equation. So like other CG models, investment IND is the real investment spending in a particular sector. So some investments are exogenous, some investments are endogenous. So we're going to focus on the endogenous investment part. So the first one is the user cost. We know that real interest rate is here, the depreciation rate. That's the new investment commodity price, the price of investment good. And that's just the macroeconomic equilibrium condition. And this is just the nominal value, defining the nominal investments. And now I'm going to introduce to you this Taylor rule. That's the nominal interest rate. That's the steady state real interest rate, and that's the inflation rate. And then we have this output gap. We have this inflation gap. We have the exchange rate depreciation gap, and then some shock here. So if I these parameters alpha 1, 2, and 3, those are the important ones. If I set them all equal to 0, the nominal interest rate is going to be the numeraire. If I set this alpha 1 and 2 0, alpha 3 is non-zero, so the exchange rate is going to be the numeraire. Or if I set alpha 1 and alpha 3 0, and alpha 2 is non-zero, CPI, the consumption price index, is going to be the numerator. And finally, we have this alpha 1 and 2 are 0.5, alpha 3 is 0. That's the standard Taylor rule. So in that case, we have in that standard Taylor rule. So, and then we have this foreign saving, which is the sum of FDI and net capital flow. Net capital flow is, in this case, depends on the difference between the domestic and foreign interest rates, nominal interest rate. This parameter here is important, shows us the degree of how mobile the market is. People can carry the capital between economies. So in this case, we're just going to set it equal to 0. So this NCF is exogenous. So just to focus on the impact. So, and then we have some variables. The current account balance is equal to foreign saving and then changes in official reserves. And this defines the exchange rate appreciation. The E is the exchange rate, and that's the exchange rate appreciation. That's the expected inflation rate, and the inflation rate is just determined by the price levels. So then we have some, some calibrations, so maybe I should skip it. And if you have any questions, we'll come back to this. And that's what I explained to you. So then I'm going to replicate the Pep Quantity Model. So the Pep Quantity Model can be the special case of the current monetary model in the presence of nominal rigidities. So we're going to consider three cases, A, B, and C. In A case, we have the real interest rate is numeric. So I'm going to set all these alphas equal to 0. In the case B, CPI is the numeric. So I'm going to put set alpha 1 and alpha 2 0 and alpha 2 very high values. So the central bank cares only about inflation. The last one is the case central bank cares only about the exchange rate. So we're just going to set those values. The shock is just a 10% growth rate in government spending, which is nominal government spending in period 3. And then I'm going to simulate the two models, the monetary model and the real model, and then compare the results. And in both cases, the results are going to be the percentage deviations from the balance growth values for some selected variables. So here, I'm just going to focus on the period 3. So you can see the PEP model here, real GDP, consumption, exports, all the government spending, real imports, nominal CPI, exchange rate. So the PEP model is expecting this, and the monetary model is expecting this. So in this case, the real interest rate is numeric. All the alphas are set equal to 0. So here, again, you can see the same, and here, same. All trying to show that the Pep Quantity Model can be the special case of this model. And next one is, I'm going to explain the nominal exchange rate is the numerator. So here, I'm going to assume that the central bank cares only about the inflation gap in the interest rate rule, and the other, they don't care about the other gaps. So you can see that the results are again very similar for all the variables. So you can see that in this case is 0 because in the PEP model, the exchange rate is normalized, so it doesn't change.
Hi, Raja. You have 5 minutes, huh?
Okay, that's fine. And the next one is the CPI is the numerator. So central bank cares only about the CPI inflation rate, inflation gap. Again, results are very similar. So you can see this thing. So then once we are proved that the real model can be considered as the special case of the general monetary model, with nominal rigidities. So then we are going to say that the interest rate can be seen as the hybrid yet endogenous numeraire. So the current model has absolute price, and so we can talk about inflation in this case. And alternatively, the interest rate rule represents the money market equilibrium condition, which is LM curve. Interest rate is basically the LM curve. So without the LM curve, we fix the nominal or real interest rate, which pins down the particular point on the IS curve, the goods market equilibrium condition. Then we know that interest rate rule, now once it's introduced, satisfies both real and monetary side of the economy. So the one side of the coin, while the other side is the real economy, the IS curve. So the question is this: since the Pep Quantity Model with nominal rigidity is a special case of the Pep Quantity Monetary Model, the question is which specification is right in the short run? So is the monetary model with popular Taylor rule is better? So those are the things. So I'm going to compare three cases. One is the Taylor case, Taylor rule case. We have this. One is the exchange rate case, which is sets the exchange rate as the numeraire. The CPI case, which is sets the CPI, the consumption price index, as a numeraire. So again, we're going to consider the same shock, and then round it. So you can see that in this case, the unemployment rate is fixed, and so it's very much like a classical economy in the short run, but still some variables are nominally exogenous. Nominal variables are exogenously fixed. So here we can see no change in real GDP because both capital and labor are fixed, so we don't see any real impact in GDP. But we can see some changes in nominal variables here, different results. Exports are different, consumptions are different, government spending real are very different. You can see that, those are different. The imports are different, investments are different, not in nominal terms. Consumption price index here is, we can see 2% inflation rate here in Taylor model, but in the exchange rate is the number where we see this, but in consumption price index is the number we don't see any change. And then we can see this case and the nominal wage, we can see that as well. And for the value added of the sectors, we can see these very different results again. See that? And then interesting case is once the monetary model is endogenous variable, monetary model is more general, so which gives us this gives us the exchange rate and consumption price index values. So I'm taking those endogenously determined values from the monetary model back into the real model, and then shock those numeraires. So then I'm going to end up with exactly the same results for the value added changes. For the same thing, we're going to use for the nominal wages is actually nominal wages. Okay, so that was the full employment case. Now I'm going to focus on the sticky wage. So I'm fixing the nominal wage and then shock the model with the same shock. And then you can see that we have the real effect here in real GDP, and the results are here. Very different again. So, and then more importantly, we have employment is increasing more in those two cases. So that's why real GDP is increasing more. And again, once again, you can see this value added of the sectors are again very different. And then I'm going to do the same thing. I'm using the endogenous changes in the exchange rate and consumption
Please,
price
Raksha,
index.
if you can go to conclusion so we can have time for discussion.
Okay, so I'm shocking the real models with the nominal, the results from the monitoring model, and then I can get the same results. So the conclusion is we introduce the tailored type monitoring policy into the real CG model, which replaces the exogenous numeric, and then we just prove that the real model can be derived as a special case of the monitoring model. And then in the presence of nominal rigidity, the choice of numeric matters, and the monitoring policy is probably more suitable for the short term because it actually takes into account of what central bank is doing. Okay, thank you.
Thanks a lot, Raksha. Thanks also to be on time. So I open the floor for questions, and I will collect in the chat. While we are waiting for reaction from our participants, I have only one question because you were showing all results, the comparison and all the results as a percentage change. I just asking myself if you check the behavior of the trade balance according to the different hypotheses. So I wonder if since usually trade balance clearly has to be linked to saving and investments, and then when you have touching nominal or real exchange rate, then you can have the impact on these variables. So have you compared the trade balance behavior? So at least have you checked in your model how the trade balance is reacting according to the different numeric choice?
Yeah, so so many results we could show, but in this model, this PEP model is actually the real PEP model is a saving-driven investment model. So the foreign saving is exogenous, and domestic savings are endogenous, and so basically the current account balance is exogenous in the real model. So I showed you that because of this, the changes in the interest rate, domestic interest rate and foreign interest rate, in terms of nominal interest rate, we could actually see that the financial capital is actually moving from one country to the rest of the world. But we closed that in with that parameter phi in the equation I showed you. So in that case, in our model, it's still basically they're assuming that foreign saving is fixed. So that means current account balance is fixed. In both models, in that respect, foreign savings is fixed and current account is fixed. So all the adjustments are going through the experts in reports.
Okay, thanks. We don't have any other questions, so
Okay.
thanks again to Raksha, and now we can move to our last presenter, which is Valijon, if I say it correctly. So it's about how Central Asia to escape from trade isolation, so policy target scenarios by CG modeling. So I leave the floor to Valijon, and yes, again, please stop your video, mute your microphone so the connection can be more stable. And if you have questions, you can put in the chat. I will collect and I will read later in the discussion time. So, Valijon, as usual, you have 20 minutes. I will tell you when 5 minutes last, and then we can move to the discussion after. Okay, the floor is yours. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks, guys. You can just call me Valley. So is everything clear? So my voice, everything clear?
Yeah, everything's clear. We can hear you and we can see perfectly your slide. So you can go ahead.
Okay, yeah. Yeah, as you told, like my presentation is about the high trade costs in Central Asia and how to reduce that trade cost by using the targeted scenarios by CG modeling. The research has been done with my professor in Kyo Chung and me. Well, so our literature review shows that high trade costs in Central Asia is mainly because of two things. The first one is let me point the laser. So hard infrastructure and the soft infrastructure. So the hard infrastructure is mainly related to the landlockedness of the Central Asian region. So you can see here the Central Asia landlocked in a region, especially Uzbekistan is a double landlocked country, which has to cross two countries at least to see the seaport. So that is very bad fortune. And then it increased the cost of trade in Central Asia. So you for example, just simple example from equipment imports from Korea to Uzbekistan. Let's see this simple example. If you see this simple example, so if some equipment is the imported from the Korea, logistic cost through the China, which is the land logistic, is like $9,000. While the same product, if it is exported through the sea logistics, it is just about like $2,000, which is there is a huge like kind of differences. And then according to Rodrigue 2020, the transport costs increase like 10%, then we can expect the trade volume decreases by 20%, which is bad fortune. And another one is the soft infrastructure is not very good in Central Asia. And you can see the same example again. And then when the importers, is coming to Uzbekistan, they will face with tariff of 26% plus 15% VAT and plus like 5,000 like custom clearance something. And the same, Pakistani like importers, like they are paying like lesser logistics, and at the same time they are paying lesser tariffs because of the integration, relatively much more integration to the world economy, relative to the Central Asian countries, especially Uzbekistan and Turkmenistan, which is the most the closest economy in the world. So, and you also see that trade indicators shows that, overall landlocked average countries are doing much better comparing to the many other, Central Asian countries in terms of the trade openness, trade facilitation, or logistics performance index. So you see that landlocked average countries are, much higher, except the Kazakhstan, which is the largest economy in Central Asia. So, and this shows that, there is a problem of, trade facilitation in Central Asian countries. And you can also see here, if you look at the trade facilitation agreement of, the WTO, some countries, they have finished their, the commitment by like almost 50%, but like, Uzbekistan and Turkmenistan again, which are the two kind of second and third largest economy in Central Asia, because they are not the member of the WTO, they did nothing about the trade facilitation, at least in the paper. So the problem statement is like the hard infrastructure and soft infrastructure resulted for the negative impacts on trade and insufficient growth and poverty and unemployment in Central Asia, and also low income trap. So what is low income trap is like when you have low income region, you will have low traded volumes, and then when you have low volume volumes, you have low transport volumes, and low transport volumes leads to the high transport cost. High transport cost leads to the low transport volumes, and then it leads to low trade volumes, and then low trade volumes again makes the people have the lesser income. So this is just the vicious cycle of the low trap income, and then there's some literature review which I can just skip. So the problem statement is like hard infrastructure and soft infrastructure resulted in the high trade costs, and that is because you see here this is the average GDP per capita in the landlocked average countries, and this is the average per capita in Central Asian countries, which is much lesser than the average of the world and average of the landlocked countries. And the situation also the same in terms of national poverty line and in terms of the unemployment rate, which the Central Asian countries cannot excuse their landlockedness, because it's not only reason for trade costs being higher, because there are other reasons like kind of soft infrastructure also should be concerned. So like our proposed solution is like for reducing the hard infrastructure, we should facilitate the trade, which we mean like we have to improve the sufficient efficiency of the trade in the country. And for the trade liberalization, this is like mainly related to the tariffs, and as a result we'll have this economic growth, employment increase, and poverty decrease. And this is just like this scenario 1, scenario 2, and scenario 3, scenario 4, which I will stop by next in the next slides. So for moving on our simulation, we have to there is a prerequisite before running the simulation, so data collection and data aggregation, and then the baseline scenario. So like for sources, we collected from this the famous international data websites, and then for Turkmenistan data, we couldn't find anything except from the GTAP's taste program, and then we aggregated using the this is the taste program, how it looks like, and we aggregated data using GTAP, the egg, and also we split the Uzbekistan and Turkmenistan because they are missing in the GTAP version 10 database. So we split the region into using the split reg data program. And then finally, we updated the tariff rates. So you see here, because the latest GTAP data is 2014, we updated for using the WITS, the online data website with the latest available ones for each countries, using, of course, the run GTAP alter text function. So here is the scenarios aggregation. Scenario 1, 2, and 3 is like all Central Asian countries, 5, and then CIS FTA, which is like Commonwealth independent states, and the rest of the world. And in scenario 4, we did like Central Asian Customs Union also as a one region. And then here is the aggregation of the sectors, the industry, and then sectors. So scenario 1 is like, what if Uzbekistan and Turkmenistan join WTO? And then scenario 2 is like, what if after the joining to WTO, trade facilitation in the region increases? And scenario 3 is like, what if 5 Central Asian countries form the customs union with the common external tariff? And scenario 4 is like, because there is literature that trade is facilitated due to the customs union formation in the Central Asia. So I will explain how I did. So the first one is like, I just took the Kazakhstan as an example. Okay, Kazakhstan tariff pre and post WTO entry. You see here the pre, and then here's the post. And then I will just they calculated, okay, how much percent Kazakhstan decreased their tariff after they entered the WTO. And then this is a change, you can see. And then I got this change as a shock, and then I applied for Turkmenistan and then Uzbekistan as a shock after they entered the WTO. And then for scenario 2, it is about because the WTO trade facilitation increases, I just assume that after they enter the WTO, okay, each country levels up to the country before them. For example, Uzbekistan, the logistics performance index we have seen in our previous slides, logistic performance index in Uzbekistan increased to the Kazakhstan level. So then it has to, move. It has to improve. It is AMS, not TMS. Shock to the almost 9%. And then same thing is like for Kyrgyzstan, Turkmenistan, and Tajikistan. And for Kazakhstan, for the sake of realistic, I got Iran, and then Kazakhstan also leveled up. It is logistic performance index to the Iran level because it is Iran and Kazakhstan is located in this almost same region, and also they are belong to the same income group country. So, and then yeah, this was the AMS that I also shocked to the each countries, and then had the result. And scenario 3 is like assumed, the common external tariff, because like when you form the customs union, you have to have the common external tariff. Because the Kyrgyzstan is the most liberal country in Central Asia and the least tariffs, so I got the Kyrgyzstan as a assumed, the customs, the common external tariff. But because Kyrgyzstan doesn't have any gas or the oil, that's why for extraction I got Kazakhstan and Turkmenistan, which are the most gas and oil producers. I got the average of their tariff. And for the vehicles, because the only Uzbekistan and Kazakhstan they produce car and vehicles, I also got the average of the tariff. And then this, the tariffs will be applied as a shock and then considered as common external tariff for the customs union of the Central Asian countries in the scenario 3. And then in the scenario 4, I'm sorry, I just missed here. In the scenario 4, what I did it like I got the average of the their logistic performance index, and then I increased to the level of the sum of the same income group countries, and then logistic performance index is like out of 3 out of 5, so that AMS increased. AMS shock was like 14%. So, and then here's the result. Okay, I gave the four scenarios here in short-term effects and long-term effects. So in short-term effects, even though the Turkmenistan and Uzbekistan they lost because of the WTO accession, in the long-term effect they start gaining. And then overall, even though the CIS, especially Russia, lost because the Central Asian countries, because as you can see here, this is the scenario 4, which is Central Asian countries formed and considered as a one region, Central Asia, the customs union. So because of the customs union integration in the Central Asian countries, got higher, the Russia and other CIS countries they lost because of the trade, creation and trade. I forgot. Anyway, you understand what I mean. So they lost, but in the long term, Russia and other CIS countries they also start gaining, even though the Central Asian countries form the Central Customs Union. And then you also can see here, okay, which countries overall gained, the most welfare gain in short and long term. And then the conclusion is that Uzbekistan is a country, the most beneficial country from WTO, accession and then trade facilitation, and plus scenario 3 is like customs union among Central Asian countries. And then here are the short and long-term real GDP changes you see here. Again, because Turkmenistan and Uzbekistan is not a very big country in this scenario 1, other countries, did not see any effect. But overall, you see here, GDP is almost, the positive in all scenarios, except for Kazakhstan and Turkmenistan, they saw, a slight decrease in the long term effect when it comes to scenario 3, which is the formation of the customs union. But the overall region here is like in scenario 4, and it's short and long term, they are having much more increases in their GDP. So this is just I mean, you just can see in the long term and short term how the GDP they got changes, speed, and the overall value in dollars. So, and then also we kind of, converted GDP changes into the poverty reduction. We found several literature that shows that 1% of GDP growth reduced poverty by 2%. That's why we just had, the average GDP percentage gain from all scenario 4, because all scenario 4 is not like different scenarios, but they are just part of the, 4 several part of the one same story. So Uzbekistan has the most, the poverty reduction rate by 1.5, almost 1.5%. While in long term, the Tajikistan is a country that has the the most poverty reduction rate. And the same thing applies for employment rate. We also find some literature review that 1% of GDP growth increases employment between 0.3 and 0.8% range. So you can also see here the Turkmenistan and Tajikistan, because they are like average GDP percentage gain are higher. They also gain higher employment rate and higher the employment rate in the short and the long term. And then here is we also consider the trade balance in a long and short term. So you see here like Turkmenistan and then Uzbekistan, because of their WTO accession, they lost in a short term, in a long term, and that is the question that I could not find the answer actually. I mean, because if you see in GDP change, Turkmenistan and Uzbekistan, even though they have slightly minus GDP in their short term, they will eventually start gaining much GDP percentage change in a positive one. But when it comes to the trade balance, you see here both. The countries are gaining, having losing their trade balance. Their trade balance is worsening in the short and the long term. So that is our studies limitation. Probably at the end, if anyone knows what we should do in terms of kind of decreasing these imbalances into discussion. So, but overall, like in scenario 4, which is the formation of the customs union and then increasing, like facilitating the trade, overall, like trade balance in the region is like increasing, getting better in a short and in a long term. And then we also, showed the industry output in the short and the long term. So you see here, like this is very kind of complicated in percentage. But the thing is like here is the very visible thing is like Turkmenistan, Tajikistan got in a short term very fluctuated level. For example, like in manufacturing is like it's minus 14% decrease in the manufacturing sector, and then in the long term, in scenario 2, this is in the long term, then it got better. Or other part, for example, the vehicles is like just it's minus 4%, but we really cannot, we don't have to really consider this one because even though it's minus percent, or here is like 13%, we can just ignore this one because the Tajikistan is not a country that produces vehicles a lot. So but overall, what I noticed that the Tajikistan is a country that has very fluctuated industrial output level, in both like 4 scenarios. So as a conclusion, the policy of trade liberalization and economic integration will provide a significant economic benefits to the Central Asian countries, like GDP, welfare, GDP, and production output. And you saw that poverty also reduced, and then the employment increased because of the integration to the world economy, and then industrial output in the short term may decline in all country somehow, but it is impacts are robust in the longer term. Especially this is true for Tajikistan. So it is suggested to the Tajikistan that when they are under negotiation of the formation of the customs union, they may kind of take longer, phase out period in order to lessen the shock to their industry. So, and then trade facilitation scenarios impact the region's economy much more positively than do the tariff liberalization scenarios. What does it mean is that, the trade liberalization is not just simply, the reducing the tariff, but we have to do something, for example, improve this, the trade atmosphere in the country. So this should be signal for the Central Asian governments that trade facilitation is the thing here, not just the trade liberalization, decreasing the tariff in their economy. And then some suggestions for the Central Asian country, the government, the region is considered as peripheral territory unless the five stands unite. And previous, like unfinished, I would say, Central Asia Cooperation Organization, which is called CACO, can be blueprint in this regard, and then by forming of a customs union, they will have common single market and solve the region-wide issues collectively, attract investors to the populous region, and also cheap labor market, and have stronger voice in geopolitical world. And then WTO membership is the initial step to harmonize the trade rules among the republics, so that, because all of the countries, if all of the countries are the member of WTO, it is easy to harmonize their trade rules. And this is especially true for Uzbekistan and Turkmenistan. They should hurry to join the WTO. This is our suggestions, and limitations of our paper is that data quality should be further enhanced. Data of the Turkmenistan should be officially confirmed. I don't know, I also connected to the NHEL. How the taste got the tariffs of the Turkmenistan. And then because they also got from the NAC map of the International Trade Center of the European Union. So, but it should be kind of officially confirmed by the Turkmenistan government. But this is mostly more likely impossible. And another one is to see the results year by year. Running policy scenarios using the dynamic model can improve the results and understand policy issues usually omitted by a static model. And third one is microeconomic closure in the model should be redefined for much more accurate outcomes, especially for soothing the imbalances between the GDP and then trade balance. And the fourth one is in the future, if the Central Asia forms the customs union, it will be necessary to analyze the scenario while looking at the trend of the discussion among the Central Asian countries. And thank you.
Thanks a lot, Bali. So thanks for your nice presentation. Interesting issue related to the Central Asia countries. We already have one question, so is in the chat. So Nong is thanking you for the nice presentation, and then the question is specifically on table slides 13. So you can go to, so why do the results for countries 4 and 5 have opposite effect in the short and long run in scenario 1? This is the first question. So why country 4, Turkmenistan and Uzbekistan, apparently they have the reverse sign, the opposite effect. And then the second is, and what are the closure in the short and long run? Yeah, that is exactly also the question I was asking myself. So how can you distinguish between short and long run as a closure? And And finally, as I see the opposite impact between short-term and long-term results, so I think the closure will be reconsidered. Okay, this is just following non-question. So we have another question, but if you can clarify to long, and then we can go ahead. Yeah.
Yeah. So thanks for question. Nice question. The answer is that because actually, like what we did is in a short-term effect, we just leave the macroeconomic closure just as it is, and we use the default the Ryan GTAP's static models closure. But when it comes to long-term effect, we kind of expand the investment. Like we expended the capital so that it gives the long-term effect. So and then because when you like expand the capital, of course it drives the economy thrive, and then it shows like much more higher effect. So for Turkmenistan and Uzbekistan, like it seems that when they just because scenario one is the WTO accession, when they are just member of the WTO accession, because of the other countries coming into the country, they may kind of use some of their trade. Let me just they may use some of their trade share, and so that they may have some the minus in their welfare changes. But when it comes to the long-term effects after some years, and because of the expansion in the capital, they may increase their welfare changes. Like I don't know exactly step by step answer, but this is how my answer would be. If anyone want to add, I will be happy to hear.
Okay, then we have another question by Paul Gretton. So okay, actually two questions. So very interesting and policy relevant analysis. Thank you. And have you analyzed the link between projected investment in the long run and the trade balance? Do negative balances indicate import of capital goods? And then Paul is continuing. In the long run closure, has the impact on regional rates of return on capital been examined? So you can check also in the chat. It's not clear, but mainly the point of Paul is asking the link between the capital goods and trade balance. So investments, capital goods, and trade balance. That is mainly. So please, if you can clarify, and this is also related on your conclusion in using the dynamic model, I guess.
Okay, guys, how can I see that chat actually?
If you go on the bottom right of the screen, there is the chat button.
But like when I share the screen, it doesn't show the...
I think you should unshare your screen and to see the chat. Stop sharing the screen.
When you hover your mouse over the top.
Yeah.
Okay, I got it. Thank you.
Okay.
Yeah. So thanks, Paul, for your the question. Yeah, no, I haven't analyzed the link between projected investment in the long run and the trade balance. Actually, like that is kind of I'm looking for the answer why there is this connection between GDP, even though GDP is increasing, why the trade balance is decreasing. That is my questions, and I don't know how to answer to your the question. In the long run, has the impact of the regional rates of return on the capital been examined? Nope. we haven't examined the the impact of regional rates of return on capital.
Yeah.
So like, yeah.
But I mean, if I can say, the point of Paul is quite crucial. I believe that in your case, since this is really a policy simulation, you need to move from static to dynamic, because if you don't have, I mean, the capital accumulation or any capital inflows benefit from opening the trade, especially if we are talking of a country which, if I understood correctly, I'm not expert of the Central Asia, but if I understood correctly, the trade openness is not so big. So it means that the model, a static model, is not able to capture the full effect of opening to the market. And if I can say, as a further suggestion, it's first, I would use a different aggregation, because in this kind of policy analysis, you would look also at the change of trade partners. So especially because the position of the Central Asia, you clearly show, no, in your slides, the different route that imports goods can take, but then clearly there could be, thanks to trade aversion, the impact could be nice to analyze also from changing suppliers. And then we have also another, it's that probably you have to also to include some spillover effect, because when one country open and then also the other one open, there is also a spillover effect between the two, so you can include some mechanism of this. And then we have another question from Lukman. Could GDP grow, not could trigger a growing demand for imports, dependent on consumer preference and intermediate input demand, I guess, of the economy. So again, in the chat you can see, I don't know if it's clear enough.
GDP growth not could trigger. Couldn't GDP growth trigger a growing demand for imports depend on consumer preferences in the imports?
Yeah, it's an attempt to explain your negative trade balance, which yes, which probably is partially linked to the capital, but also could be this the case. Let's.
Yeah, Jonas, like as far as I know, like and not only consumer preferences, but also like when I asked this question, why in my results, trade balance, I mean there is like this connection between the trade balance and GDP. While the GDP is increasing, trade balance is worsening. And one guy, as far as I know, like James, he told me like you have to redefine your macroeconomic closure for like the having some kind of like consumer preferences, and also the production I forgot the exact like the term, but I like you should add some kind of the elasticity in order to have the right trade balance relative to your GDP growth. So, and he just answered in this way. Probably, I think what you mean by saying that consumer preferences and intermediate inputs, right?
Okay, so thanks to all the presenters for the very good and excellent works. Thanks to Angel for hosting this session, and I guess that we can close. We are pretty on time, so if I understood correctly, was supposed to close at 2:09, and it's 2:09. So thanks to everyone, and let's see you around in the next virtual session of this of the GTAP conference. Thanks to all, and enjoy. Bye bye.